The call came in just before dawn. The voice on the line was male, calm, and direct. There was no screaming, no hysteria, just a statement. Someone had been shot. The caller identified himself. He said he had also been injured. The location was a single-story brick house in a quiet residential area on the southeast side of Houston, Texas. Emergency services were dispatched immediately. When paramedics and police arrived, the front door was unlocked. A man stood near the entrance, tall, broad, and bleeding from his left leg. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't trying to flee. He simply leaned against the wall, hand pressed to the wound, and nodded toward the hallway. His name was Renard Spivey, a former deputy with the Harris County Sheriff's Office. He also had a background in entertainment, having appeared on a nationally syndicated courtroom reality TV show as a bailiff. But here he wasn't acting. He told officers his wife was in the bedroom, that she had been shot, that it was an accident. Police entered the master bedroom. The scene was quiet, the lighting low. A woman was lying on the floor near the closet, motionless, unresponsive. Her name was Patricia Spivey. She had been shot 3 times, in the chest, in the arm, and in the leg. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A black semi-automatic handgun rested near the foot of the bed. There were no signs of a break-in, no smashed glass, no overturned furniture, no evidence of forced entry. The house was in order. Neat. The only thing out of place was the body on the floor, the bloodstains, and the sound of the police radios chirping in the early morning silence. At that moment, nothing about the scene supported a random crime. There was no evidence of an intruder. The only people in the house were Renard and Patricia, one alive, one dead. Initial statements from Renard were brief. He told responding officers that he and Patricia had been arguing. The argument escalated. A gun was involved. It went off. More than once. He said they struggled over it, that he never meant to hurt her, that it all happened too fast. Then he sat quietly as officers moved through the home. EMS transported him to the hospital under police watch. His wound was not life-threatening. It was a single gunshot to the leg, reportedly self-inflicted or the result of the alleged struggle. Meanwhile, crime scene technicians began their work. They photographed every inch of the room, collected the weapon, measured blood spatter, checked for signs of defensive wounds. The initial forensic review would take hours, but one thing became apparent almost immediately. This was not a burglary. This was not a home invasion. There was no one else involved. The investigation now focused on what happened inside the home in the hours leading up to Patricia's death. The timeline needed to be reconstructed. What time had the shooting occurred? Had there been any calls to friends or family? Any warning signs? Text messages? Surveillance footage? Investigators secured phones, retrieved logs, and began canvassing neighbors. Renard Spivey was not an unknown figure. As a former law enforcement officer and a public personality, his name carried weight. But this wasn't about reputation. The evidence would speak louder than any history. Back at the medical examiner's office, Patricia's body was examined. The shots had all come from close range. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no bruises, no skin under her nails. Nothing to suggest she had fought back with force. Her injuries were fatal. The chest wound had been critical. Forensics would later note that the trajectory of the bullets did not clearly match a scenario involving an active struggle over the weapon, but that was for later. For now, investigators had a scene, a victim, and a suspect who claimed it was all a tragic accident. They had a neat home, no forced entry, and a married couple, one of whom would never speak again. The other had a story to tell. What investigators needed to determine was whether Renard Spivey's version of events held up against the facts. No one else had been there to see what really happened. No witnesses, no camera in the room, only a chain of physical evidence and a single survivor's account. The burden of proof, as always, would rest on the details. Angles of fire, timing of shots, injury patterns, blood distribution. These facts would tell the truth if anyone was willing to listen to them. But already something didn't sit right. Something about the scene felt controlled, almost sterile, especially for what had supposedly been a violent physical struggle. As crime scene tape went up around the modest house on Briscoe Street, a much larger investigation began to take shape. It would stretch on for years, draw national attention, and spark deep public debate about justice, power, and the appearance of truth. At the center of it all was a former officer with a gunshot wound and a dead wife in the closet. And from the very first day, the question hovered in the air. Was it really an accident? The first 24 hours after a homicide are critical, not because a case will necessarily be solved in that window, but because the rawest version of the facts, the clearest conditions of the scene, and the unfiltered behavior of the suspect are all available. Before attorneys step in, before narratives shift. By early morning, Renard Spivey had been transported to the hospital. He had a single gunshot wound to the leg, not fatal, not especially deep. He received treatment under supervision. He remained cooperative. Not once did he request a lawyer. That to seasoned investigators is rarely a sign of innocence. It's a sign of control. Renard Spivey was not new to pressure. As a former deputy sheriff with the Harris County Sheriff's Office, he had worked in the same system now reviewing his actions. More publicly, he had served as a television bailiff on a syndicated courtroom reality series. His appearance, demeanor, and calm communication style were familiar to millions. A man comfortable with authority and with the image of order. But reputation doesn't exempt one from scrutiny. The department immediately launched a parallel inquiry. The victim was Patricia Marshall Spivey, 52 years old, employed, known to be private but dependable. A longtime member of her church, she was described by co-workers as mild-tempered. She was kind, one colleague said, not the kind of person you'd expect to be in the middle of a violent scene. That sentiment would echo in the days ahead. Renard and Patricia had been married for years. It was not their first marriage. Neighbors viewed them as quiet, low-key, not especially social but stable. They saw the couple walk their dog occasionally. They saw Patricia gardening. They didn't hear shouting. They didn't see police visits. But what neighbors see and what goes on behind walls are rarely the same. Detectives began collecting data from both lives. Phones were seized. Text message records requested. Social media accounts reviewed. This wasn't about character. This was about stress, motive, and history. Three pillars that often precede intimate partner homicide. What began to emerge was not a pattern of violence, but a pattern of distance. According to preliminary interviews with Patricia's close family, she had recently expressed growing discomfort in the relationship. Not fear, at least not in her words, but weariness. She described emotional disconnection, unexplained tension, and increasingly controlling behavior. She told a relative that arguments were becoming routine. She felt like she couldn't express herself. It's like walking on glass, she allegedly said. I never know what version of him I'll get. To the outside world, Renard was composed. On television, he enforced court rules with measured firmness. But there is a difference between playing a peacekeeper and being one. Police investigators noted early that his tone, even while under observation for a shooting, lacked grief. There was no breakdown, no spiral. He answered questions, offered a sequence of events, and repeated that it was an accident. The phrasing was careful. We were struggling over the gun. It went off. A statement like that triggers a cascade of forensic comparisons. If it had been a genuine struggle, there would be signs, fingerprints on the firearm, scratches or bruises on arms and hands, torn fabric, defensive wounds. At the scene, those markers were largely absent. Patricia had no marks consistent with a violent altercation, no skin under her fingernails, no bruising on her wrists. The blood spatter pattern was largely confined to where she fell. There was minimal evidence of movement after the shots were fired. In homicide cases involving intimate partners, context matters. So do the details, especially small ones. The weapon was located roughly 3 feet from the body. Police asked, if it was a close-quarter struggle, how did the gun end up so far away? Why were there 3 rounds fired? Renard did not offer answers beyond the initial narrative. There had been an argument, it escalated, and a tragedy occurred. But investigators weren't looking for emotion. They were looking for inconsistencies. Meanwhile, family members were asked to provide insight. Patricia's brother confirmed that just weeks prior, she had confided in him. Her marriage was not in a good place. She didn't say she was afraid for her life, but she had been collecting documentation, possibly related to finances or property. The implication was that she might have been preparing for separation. If true, that would be critical context. A partner facing the loss of control, particularly a partner trained in law enforcement, often sees that loss as existential. The narrative was shifting, not wildly, not publicly, but quietly, piece by piece. This wasn't about proving guilt. It was about understanding how a woman ended up dead, in her own home, with only her husband present, and 3 bullets in her body. From the outside, the Spivey household had always looked steady. Renard's prior service gave him a badge and a stage. But behind closed doors, the story might have been very different. This case wasn't going to be resolved by public opinion or personal history. It would come down to the facts: ballistics, blood patterns, timelines, digital footprints, and above all, motive. At this stage, Renard Spivey was not officially under arrest, but the questions surrounding him were growing, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. The house on Briscoe Street no longer held mystery. It held data, and it was now the job of forensic science to interpret it. Crime scene analysis does not begin with conclusions. It begins with questions. Each object is evaluated in relation to another. Each stain, each fiber, each drop of blood is a statement, a fact that doesn't speak but can be made to confess. It was this process that revealed the case was not as straightforward as it had first been framed. 3 gunshot wounds had ended Patricia Spivey's life. The location of those wounds, their angle, and the distance from which they were fired all mattered. 1 to the chest, 1 to the arm, 1 to the thigh. Each fired in succession, none immediately lethal on their own. But together they painted a different story. Medical examiners concluded that the chest wound was ultimately fatal, but not instantly so. There was no indication that Patricia had died instantly. That detail alone mattered. It meant there had been time between the shooting and her death. Time that could have been used to seek help. Time that passed without a 911 call. In most accidental shootings, emergency services are called immediately, often in panic. In this case, the call came later. Investigators began working backwards from the 9/11 timestamp. According to data retrieved from mobile phone logs, activity on both Patricia's and Renard's phones stopped nearly 30 minutes before the emergency call was made. That window of silence raised questions. Gunshot residue was collected from both parties. As expected, Renard tested positive. Patricia did not. There was no residue on her hands, no evidence she had handled the weapon. This contradicted the idea of a struggle for the gun. If she hadn't touched it, how had it discharged 3 times in a supposed fight for control? The trajectory of each bullet was charted. Forensic pathologists matched entry points with the position of the body and determined that all 3 shots were fired from a relatively consistent height. Consistent with someone shooting downward, not while grappling for control. The distances involved, particularly the chest wound, indicated the gun was fired from more than 2 feet away. Not contact range, not struggle range. That detail would weigh heavily in the evolving narrative. Officers reviewing the crime scene noted the gun's placement. It had been found several feet from Patricia's body, not within arm's reach. There was no trail of blood near the weapon, no smeared prints, no signs of a fall where the gun might have bounced. Its isolated position made less sense if the struggle had ended there. It looked staged, but suspicion alone isn't evidence. Investigators needed more. They turned to Renard's medical report. His injury, a gunshot wound to the thigh, had exited cleanly. The trajectory was downward and from the front. Again, this mattered. In a physical struggle, self-inflicted wounds often appear at oblique angles, reflecting the chaos of movement. This one didn't. The wound pattern did not align with the sequence he described. The evidence was beginning to contradict the most basic elements of the original story. That story was, we fought over a gun, it went off, we both got hit. But the forensic breakdown showed that Patricia was shot from a distance and with purpose, not accidentally, not in a flurry of random fire. Meanwhile, additional investigative work uncovered a set of texts Patricia had sent in the days leading up to the incident. They were brief, uneasy. She had told a friend she was emotionally drained. She had described Renard's behavior as distant, cold, controlling. In one message, she said, "He's not the same anymore." These messages weren't dramatic or fearful. They were resigned. The kind of quiet despair that doesn't usually make headlines, but says everything to an investigator reading between the lines. Even more telling was a browser search found on Patricia's tablet. How to leave a spouse safely. That search had been conducted the evening before she died. No one knew if she intended to confront him or simply gather information, but the timing couldn't be ignored. To a jury, these digital traces might have been dismissed as circumstantial. To law enforcement, they formed a subtle but critical narrative. Patricia had been preparing to reclaim autonomy, and something or someone had interrupted that plan. Her phone was locked when investigators found it, but the analysis team retrieved the data. She hadn't called or texted anyone in the final hour of her life. Her last message had been sent an hour before midnight. After that, nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, just silence. The structure of the evening, the positioning of the body, the timing of the shots, all these elements spoke louder than any alibi. And what they said was that Patricia had likely been caught off guard, that there had been no real struggle, that the scene, quiet and orderly, matched not an accident, but an execution. At this point, Renard Spivey remained under supervised medical recovery. He was not yet under arrest. No charges had been filed. But the foundation for probable cause was rapidly forming. In Texas, domestic violence cases that escalate to homicide are not uncommon, but they rarely involve former deputies or public figures. That reality made the case more complex, not less. Investigators knew they would need airtight forensic evidence to withstand defense arguments built on reputation, service record, and the lack of eyewitnesses. The problem with crimes behind closed doors is that the truth is often buried with the victim, but science, in its methodical process, had begun to exhume it, piece by piece. This wasn't about judgment, it was about pattern recognition. The pattern, in this case, was one of control, breakdown, silence, and irreversible consequence. A homicide investigation doesn't hinge on confession. It hinges on contradiction. By the end of the first week, the story offered by Renard Spivey had been repeated multiple times with subtle but telling shifts. What began as a claim of an accidental shooting during a struggle now included new variables: stress, medication, fatigue, and emotional distance. Each retelling was technically consistent but increasingly tailored. This pattern, not uncommon among suspects, made one thing clear to investigators. Renard was working to manage perception, not just recall facts. The Houston Police Department escalated their review, coordinating with the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were briefed on the emerging forensic discrepancies, the gunshot trajectories, the absence of defensive wounds on Patricia, and the 30-minute delay between the incident and the emergency call. These were not just red flags. They were critical elements in building probable cause. Renard's status shifted from involved party to primary person of interest. Still, no arrest was made. Authorities proceeded cautiously, gathering every available layer of evidence to avoid a premature move that could compromise legal standing. This was a case that would attract attention, not just because of the violence involved, but because of who Renard was. His history as a law enforcement officer complicated the public narrative. Publicly, there was restraint, no press conferences, no dramatic headlines. The district attorney's office understood the optics. Charging a former deputy required airtight reasoning. Anything less risked the appearance of bias or personal vendetta. In private, though, the momentum was shifting. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed additional people from Renard and Patricia's personal lives. A former co-worker of Patricia described her demeanor at work as tense in the weeks before the shooting. She wasn't herself, they said. Another friend disclosed that Patricia had once mentioned her husband didn't like being questioned and had a tendency to shut things down with silence. These weren't direct accusations, but they helped shape a portrait of control, not violence but coercion, a pattern that often precedes domestic homicide. No one had seen the shooting. No neighbor reported hearing gunshots. That silence in and of itself was alarming. The weapon used was a .40 caliber handgun, not a quiet firearm. The house sat on a relatively narrow residential street. Yet not a single person nearby had called police to report gunfire. That left two possibilities. Either the shots were suppressed, which evidence did not support, or the event had taken place during a window of time when the house was otherwise silent, and the outside world remained unaware. This lack of response underscored the isolation of the incident. It occurred entirely in private, with no interruption and no witnesses. That silence became part of the narrative. During this phase of the investigation, a subtle but important detail emerged. When officers first arrived on scene, they noted Renard's appearance. No visible injuries to his hands or arms, no torn clothing, no bruises. If there had been a genuine physical fight over a loaded weapon, one would expect evidence of struggle on both participants. But Renard's body told no such story. He had a clean gunshot wound to his leg and otherwise showed no trauma. Patricia, meanwhile, had injuries only from the bullets. The implications of this contrast were significant, not just because they weakened the self-defense theory, but because they suggested a lack of physical confrontation altogether. Investigators considered that if there was no struggle, the act had likely been one-sided and decisive. Public interest in the case grew steadily. While media coverage remained relatively measured, online discussion intensified. Some defended Renard, pointing to his service record and calm demeanor. Others questioned why a man trained in weapon safety would let a domestic argument escalate to gunfire. But online speculation held no value in court. Only the evidence mattered. The district attorney's team prepared the basis for formal charges. Internal discussions centered on how to present the timeline, how to introduce forensic findings, and how to contextualize Patricia's recent behavior without violating evidentiary rules. One line in her digital correspondence stood out: "He's not listening anymore." It wasn't dramatic, but it was telling. In domestic violence cases, escalation often follows emotional withdrawal. The partner seeking space is often perceived as a threat to control. That perception can drive irreversible decisions. Renard was eventually asked to return for a formal interview under caution. By this point, he had retained legal counsel. His responses were measured, shorter. He reiterated his version of events, but refrained from elaborating. His silence on certain questions, particularly about the delay in calling 911, did not go unnoticed. Prosecutors understood that silence wasn't guilt, but it did shape perception. In court, juries are instructed not to infer meaning from silence. Investigators are not so restricted. With forensic data, behavioral analysis, digital records, and post-incident inconsistencies accumulating, prosecutors move forward. Renard Spivey was officially charged with murder. The charge was second degree, not capital, acknowledging the absence of premeditation evidence, but affirming the intent and fatal outcome. He turned himself in without incident. The arrest didn't bring closure. Patricia was still gone. Her family, blindsided by the abruptness of it all, faced grief wrapped in confusion. There had been no history of physical violence, no protective orders, no screaming matches. Yet here they were preparing for trial. In the aftermath, a question quietly circulated among investigators. How many signs go unnoticed not because they're hidden, but because they're subtle? Emotional manipulation, withdrawal, isolation. These are not loud alarms. They're quiet warnings, and too often they're ignored until it's too late. Once charges were filed, the case entered a new phase. Investigation gave way to preparation. Every finding, every detail, and every inconsistency collected in the months before would now be weighed under the strict framework of law. Homicide may be emotional in nature, but trials are not. They are structured, rule-bound, and deeply reliant on precision. Renard Spivey's arrest was not met with outrage, nor was it met with celebration. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that reflects uncertainty, not clarity. The public had questions. His former colleagues kept their opinions private. The media's attention remained steady but cautious. There were no headlines that screamed guilt, only ones that hinted at tragedy. Prosecutors understood the uphill nature of the case. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no security footage, no prior reports of domestic abuse. The jury would not be presented with clear-cut motive or dramatic revelations. Instead, the case would rest on forensics, circumstantial patterns, and the absence of alternative explanations. In murder trials involving intimate partners, one of the greatest legal challenges is separating perception from fact. The absence of visible abuse does not mean abuse did not exist, but courts require more than assumption. They require proof, not just of death, but of intent. That would be the central tension in building the case against Spivey. The state's timeline was straightforward: a marriage under strain, a sudden escalation, a delay in calling for help, and a version of events unsupported by physical evidence. Patricia was shot 3 times. No blood on her hands, no struggle marks, a gun discharged in sequence, not in chaos, the body undisturbed, the weapon placed far from her reach, and a man trained in firearms offering explanations that shifted subtly but meaningfully. Intent would be inferred, not spoken. That required a careful presentation. The prosecution needed to guide jurors to a conclusion without overstating claims. Overreach in this kind of trial was dangerous. The burden of proof was on them, and jurors were notoriously skeptical in cases where the emotional element was present but invisible. Meanwhile, Renard's defense strategy was predictable: credibility, prior service, and reasonable doubt. His attorneys argued that there was no evidence of prior violence, no financial motive, no digital trail suggesting premeditation. They emphasized the possibility that Patricia may have approached him during a moment of heightened conflict, and that the gun discharged in a tragic accident. The wound on Renard's leg would be positioned as a sign of struggle, not a fabrication. The defense also leaned on perception. Renard's career in law enforcement gave him an appearance of control. That could be framed as discipline, not deception. The calm demeanor noted by police wasn't abnormal, they argued. It was consistent with someone trained not to panic. This was a battle of framing. Facts would be the same for both sides. How those facts were interpreted, that would determine the outcome. Jury selection began under scrutiny. Attorneys for both parties probed potential jurors on views surrounding domestic conflict, law enforcement credibility, and personal beliefs about self-defense. Prosecutors were cautious not to trigger bias. They avoided emotional appeals during voir dire. They needed jurors who could follow forensic logic, not ones seeking drama. Back outside the courtroom, Patricia's family remained visible but composed. They chose not to engage with media, issuing only a single statement: "We believe in the process. We believe in who Patricia was. We trust that the truth will come forward." The emotional weight of that statement wasn't in what it said. It was in what it avoided. No accusations, no outrage, just quiet resolve. That dignity contrasted starkly with the silence inside the Spivey household that night. It humanized the victim without theatricality, something prosecutors hoped jurors would remember. In pretrial hearings, new questions emerged. The defense requested suppression of certain digital messages, arguing context was unclear. The state pushed back, arguing the messages illustrated state of mind. Ultimately, the court allowed portions of Patricia's texts and emails to be introduced, specifically those indicating stress, withdrawal, and emotional detachment. One text written just days before her death read, "I don't feel safe talking anymore. I just keep everything inside now." It wasn't proof of fear, but it wasn't irrelevant either. It gave voice to someone who could no longer speak for herself. As opening statements neared, legal analysts acknowledged the case's complexity. It wasn't about proving Renard was abusive. It was about showing that Patricia's death was not the result of an accident, that 3 bullets, fired deliberately, could not be explained away by panic, that a 30-minute delay to call for help could not be dismissed as confusion, that silence after death spoke volumes, and that forensics in its cold clarity told a story of control, not chaos. The trial was set to begin. The first day of trial did not begin with drama. It began with routine, a formality that belied the gravity of what was at stake. The courtroom was sterile and structured. No cameras, no visible tension. Just a small gallery, quiet observers, and 2 legal teams preparing to tell competing versions of the same night. Renard Spivey entered in a suit and tie. No handcuffs, no sign of emotion. He looked exactly as he had during his television appearances. Composed, restrained, professional. But this time he wasn't playing a part. The man who had once enforced courtroom order was now standing trial for taking a life. Opening statements framed the battlefield. The prosecution laid out their theory. This was not a crime of passion, nor a moment of confusion. It was an act of control, a final assertion of dominance in a deteriorating relationship. The defense countered no premeditation, no history of abuse, and no clear motive. Just a tragic outcome from an escalating argument between two people under strain. Jurors were presented with the autopsy report first, not in graphic detail, but with clinical precision. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 fatal to the chest, no evidence of close-range contact, no powder burns, no indication of defensive action on Patricia's part. These were not stray bullets from a scuffle. They were directed, intentional, and methodical. Then came the photographs. No theatrics, no music, no commentary, just images of the bedroom, the body, the blood patterns on the floor. The gun positioned away from Patricia's hands. The room largely undisturbed. It wasn't a crime scene that told a story of chaos. It was quiet, disturbingly so. Expert witnesses explained the forensic inconsistencies in Renard's account. The trajectory of the bullets did not align with a physical struggle. His own wound, self-reported as part of that scuffle, was more consistent with a self-inflicted shot, either accidental or controlled. Gunshot residue patterns, or the lack thereof, further reinforced the state's version that Patricia had not handled the weapon at all. The prosecution introduced Patricia's final messages. They weren't angry. They weren't frightened. They were weary. "I'm tired of having to manage his moods," one text read. Another, sent 2 nights before the shooting. "I don't feel like I matter anymore." These were not cries for help. They were quiet resignations, and that made them all the more haunting. Still, the defense held ground. They emphasized the absence of direct evidence proving intent. No witnesses, no suicide notes, no recorded threats. They leaned on Renard's career, nearly 2 decades of law enforcement without incident. They argued that people in emotional turmoil do unpredictable things, and that accidents happen even to trained officers, especially under stress. They called attention to Patricia's phone searches, questioning whether she might have confronted Renard, pushing him into a reactive state. It was speculative, but tactically effective. Reasonable doubt does not require proof. It only needs possibility. But the prosecution stayed focused. They didn't chase emotion. They stayed with the physical evidence, the sequence of shots, the absence of struggle, the timeline delay. They reminded jurors that Patricia was shot 3 times, not once, that Renard waited before calling 911. That help was not sought immediately, despite having a phone, training, and access. The most critical moment came during cross-examination of the lead forensic analyst. The defense pressed for alternate interpretations. Could the body have moved? Could the gun have discharged while falling? Could Patricia have reached for it? The analyst didn't speculate. He returned to the evidence. No blood trail from the weapon to the victim. No fingerprints from the victim on the firearm. No defensive injuries. 3 rounds fired from consistent height. "These are not characteristics of a mutual struggle," he said. Silence followed that testimony. Not dramatic silence, analytical silence. The kind that settles when theory meets unshakable fact. Renard did not testify. The defense rested without placing him on the stand. The decision was tactical. Putting a defendant on the stand in a murder trial is risky. Any hesitation, any inconsistency can be fatal. And in this case, the defense knew their strength lay in questioning the state's conclusions, not offering new ones. Closing arguments were measured. The state asked the jury not for vengeance, but for recognition, that Patricia had no chance to defend herself, that the physical evidence could not be ignored, that 3 bullets could not be explained away. The defense returned to uncertainty. They reminded the jury of what was missing: a confession, a history of violence, a clear motive. They asked them to resist the urge to assume, to demand absolute clarity before delivering judgment. The jury was released to deliberate. What followed was a waiting game. Hours passed, then a day. No verdict. That was not unusual, but it was telling. Jurors weren't divided on what had happened. They were divided on what could be proved. On the third day, the jury returned their verdict, not guilty. There was no reaction in the room, not from Renard, not from Patricia's family, just silence. The kind that only comes when a system delivers a result that doesn't feel like resolution. The verdict was final. Renard Spivey walked out of court a free man. Legally, the system had spoken, not guilty. But the echoes of that decision didn't end at the courtroom doors. They lingered quietly and painfully in the lives of those left behind. Patricia's family never sought media attention. They didn't hold press conferences or campaign for justice reform. Instead, they mourned quietly. They had lost a sister, a daughter, a friend, not in a sudden accident, but in a home where she had once believed she was safe. The silence surrounding her final moments became part of the grief. There was no closure, only the unsettling realization that some truths never make it into evidence. For law enforcement, the case remained a point of quiet frustration. Investigators had built their case meticulously, from trajectory analysis to digital footprints. Every piece pointed toward a conclusion they couldn't legally say with certainty. The lesson was familiar but difficult. In the absence of a confession or witness, even strong forensic evidence can be interpreted in more than one way. Juries are instructed to seek clarity. Life often does not provide it. Renard returned to life beyond the headlines, but his public image had changed. While acquitted, he would always be remembered in connection to the trial. Years later, unrelated legal troubles would again bring his name into circulation. But by then, the case of Patricia Spivey had already faded from public attention. And yet, for those who followed it closely, the case remains a reflection of something deeper, about control, silence, and the limits of the justice system. Patricia never cried out. She never filed a report. She never told the world she felt unsafe. She simply withdrew, quietly. And it's that silence that made her story so difficult to prosecute and so impossible to forget. Justice in this case was defined not by who was convicted, but by who was missing. And what remained wasn't vengeance or satisfaction, but a reminder that even in a system built on facts, some losses can't be measured in legal terms, and some verdicts, though final, will always feel unfinished. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.